Okay, well, hello everyone, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies. My name is Mariam Namazi. I am a journalist for Al Jazeera English, and I would like to welcome you to the launch of this report of the high-level panel on international financial accountability, transparency, and integrity for achieving the 2030 agenda. It's really a pleasure to be with you all today to focus on this important initiative. And of course, it couldn't come at a more significant time when the world is facing a public health crisis, impending unfolding recession, and a crisis of confidence. For years, there has been political deadlock on how to combat illicit financial flows and to ensure tax justice. And really, this report represents an opportunity to finally break that deadlock. The past year, of course, has been challenging for everyone, but perhaps it's also brought about a fundamental shift in our thinking and our priorities. Schools, hospitals, healthcare systems, in fact, our government's own designation of essential workers is perhaps a reflection of this shift. We know that illicit financial flows diminish resources for investment in sustainable development and those crucial public services that are now more crucial than ever. And a lack of transparency and accountability sharpens those inequalities, erodes human rights. We're all affected by this in every country in the world, but of course it's the developing countries that are disproportionately affected, and women, children, poor and vulnerable populations suffer most. So now is the time to align our global tax standards with sustainable development and human rights. I'm pleased to say that this event will bring the FACTI panel chairs together with the high-level representatives from the member states. There are two parts to the program today. There is a high-level segment which will then be followed by a moderated panel discussion among the invited speakers, and that will give us an opportunity to really take a closer look at the report's recommendations and the vital contribution it can make to this conversation, which is happening at a very important time, and how that can drive this agenda forward. I'm going to start now with actually a statement that we have from the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has this statement for the launch of this report. The COVID-19 pandemic has revealed our global fragility, but fragility extends far beyond health systems. It affects a great many of our global institutions and multilateral efforts. We see it in our inability to respond effectively to the climate crisis. It's also apparent in the burgeoning inequality that defines our times. More than 70% of the world's people are living with rising income and wealth inequality. The 26 richest people in the world hold as much wealth as half the global population. And they got dramatically richer during the pandemic, while the number of extreme poor rose. This is no longer tolerable. Economies and financial systems must serve people, sustain the planet, and strengthen social bonds. They must be founded on sustainability and inclusivity. To do that, they must also be fair and characterized by integrity. This is why I warmly welcome the report of the high-level panel on international financial accountability, transparency, and integrity for achieving the 2030 agenda. The panel has delved into how corruption is criminal, how it circumvents rules, and how current international tax norms deprive governments of needed revenue. The panel has also provided a vision of a better system that works for all, as well as recommendations for building more robust systems for accountability, transparency, and integrity. Raising more resources and restoring trust in national and international institutions are crucial for recovering from the pandemic and achieving the sustainable development goals. I look forward to action by member states and all relevant stakeholders as we pursue this vital work. So a statement on the panel's final report there from the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. So I'm now pleased to say that we can hear from His Excellency Mr. Volkan Bozkır, 75th President of the General Assembly.
His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations. His Excellency Ambassador Münir Akram, 76th President of the Economic and Social Council. His Excellency Mr. Ibrahim Mayaki, former Prime Minister of Niger, FACTI Panel co-chair. Her Excellency Ms. Dalia Grybauskaite, former President of Lithuania, FACTI Panel co-chair. Ms. Mariam Nemazi, Excellencies, thank you for joining us this morning at the launch of the report of the high-level panel on international financial accountability, transparency, and integrity for achieving the 2030 agenda. Allow me to express my sincere appreciation to the panel and to our co-chairs for their continued work to address critical areas of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda for Financing and Development. A great deal of analytical work was undertaken in the process of developing this report, and the insights it offers are invaluable to our shared agenda. I would also like to acknowledge the foresight of the former PGA and the former president of ECOSOC for prioritizing financial accountability, transparency, and integrity for achieving the 2030 agenda, and for setting the wheels in motion for his high-level panel. Excellencies, financial integrity is paramount to the success of the 2030 agenda, and the panel's report proposes a blueprint to address the critical challenges that stand in the way of progress, particularly the issue of illicit financial flows. These efforts are all the more important in light of the ongoing pandemic. Developing countries could not afford to lose resources during the best of times, and they certainly cannot afford to now, in the midst of the COVID crisis. As an international community committed to addressing inequality and advancing sustainable development, we must put in place the very principles of transparency, sound governance, and accountability that we are so often champion. Failure to do so denies vulnerable people access to basic infrastructure and services and condemns them to a life of inequality and poverty. In this regard, I welcome the approach developed by the FACTI Panel, which builds on decades of work by countries and the UN and proposes a new system to foster fairness, accountability, and integrity in the financial system for sustainable development. I also welcome the 14 recommendations of the FACTI Panel and express confidence that, if duly implemented, they can advance progress towards achieving Agenda 2030. Excellencies, in closing, allow me to emphasize that none of us stand to benefit from failure to act. The onus is on each of us to put in place a system of financial integrity for sustainable development. Doing so not only frees up resources that would otherwise be lost, but builds trust in our international, national, and local systems of governance, demonstrating transparency, accountability, and the ability to deliver on the 2030 agenda. I would like to once again thank the panel and the co-chairs, as well as call on all member states to take note of the recommendations of the report and to implement the necessary policy actions, including in light of the General Assembly special session on corruption to take place from 2 to 4th of June. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Bozkir, thank you very much. We can now hear from His Excellency Mr. Munir Akram, 76th President of the Economic and Social Council.
Thank you, Ms. Namazi. Excellency President of the General Assembly, Mr. Volkan Bozkir, Mr. Secretary General of the United Nations, co-chairs of the FACTI Panel, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is a matter of great pleasure for me to join you for the launch of the final report of the high-level panel on financial accountability, transparency, and integrity. I must acknowledge the efforts and vision of my predecessor, Ambassador Mona Jewel of Norway, and the previous president of the General Assembly, Ambassador Tijani Muhammad Bande of Nigeria, who jointly launched this panel. Excellencies, every year, trillions of dollars flow out of the developing countries due to the activities of criminals, corrupt politicians and officials, and tax evaders. The estimates of such illicit financial flows are staggering. Turning a blind eye to such illicit flows, especially during the time of economic recession triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic, is nothing short of criminal. We are all aware that illicit financial flows are a major reason for many of the developmental and socio-economic challenges faced by the developing countries. If these flows are halted and the stolen assets returned forthwith, the developing countries would be able to meet the estimated $4.3 trillion which they need to recover from the COVID crisis and achieve the SDGs. Excellencies, no country can fight this menace alone. It is a systemic problem and requires systemic solutions. We therefore need to target the loopholes in the global financial structures and institutions which enable and allow such illicit financial transactions to continue and grow. As a first step, the existence of the safe havens that receive such illicit money must be dismantled. I would urge all haven countries, as a first step, to unconditionally and expeditiously return the stolen assets and eliminate the laws and regulations and institutions that enable such flows to go to such havens. Secondly, enablers of the corruption and crimes and illicit flows, such as lawyers, accountants, and financial institutions, need to be criminalized in these haven countries. Third, I fully endorse the panel's suggestion to create a value system that encourages honesty, integrity, and transparency in all financial transactions by strengthening the policy framework and relevant national and international regulations, laws, and institutions. The panel has provided a framework for action. I agree with the panel's assessment that there is a need for an international pact on implementing financial integrity for sustainable development. I fully support the creation of a forum under the United Nations to coordinate all bodies dealing with various aspects of the illicit financial flows. We need to incorporate the panel's 14 recommendations in our discussions at the United Nations, and in this regard, I urge member states to give consideration to these recommendations, especially during the forthcoming Financing for Development Forum in April. As President of the Economic and Social Council, I have dedicated a segment of the 2021 Financing for Development Forum on illicit financial flows to consider the recommendations of the FACTI panel. I look forward to concrete actions by member states in ECOSOC, in the General Assembly, and in all other relevant forums. I thank you for this opportunity to participate in this launch of the panel's report. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, His Excellency Mr. Munir Akram, 76th President of Economic and Social Council there. We can now get a presentation of the panel's final report from His Excellency Mr. Ibrahim Mayaki, former Prime Minister of Niger and FACTI panel co-chair.
Thank you, Mr. Nemazi. Monsieur le Président de l'Assemblée Générale,
President of the General Assembly, President of the Economic and Social Council, Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor and pleasure for my co-chair, Ms. Grybauskaite, and for myself to present the content of this report, which was the subject of intense work throughout a full year. I will now switch to English.
This report is based on a certain number of critical points. We will briefly look at the background of which led us to the work that we did develop, the findings, the approach, the pact that we enhance, the scale of the illicit financial flows, and fundamentally the recommendations. So I will quickly start with a background. As it was mentioned previously, this panel was launched in March 2020 as an initiative of the 74th President of the United Nations General Assembly and the 75th President of the United Nations Economic and Social Council. So the mandate notes very clearly that insufficient financial accountability, transparency, and integrity erodes the ability of countries to raise revenue. So the main target of this report is fundamentally to fill the gap regarding the financing of the SDGs of Agenda 2030. Next slide, please. As we went through our analytical work, we reached critical findings. The first one was the fact that it was a double theft that we were observing. Not only an expropriation of funds, but also the fact that this expropriation robs billions of people of a better future. And this is totally contrary to the spirit of sustainability. And this situation evidently is ethically unsustainable as it drains resources from development. So by strengthening integrity within global finance, we can better deliver not only on developmental issues, but also on peace and prosperity. Next slide, please. So we are proposing a new approach, which is based on a fundamental diagnosis. The problem is systemic. It then requires systemic solutions, which means that an entire ecosystem approach based on values, policies, and institutions, which are driven by a unified aim, foster a system of financial integrity for sustainable development. Let me re-insist on the systemic dimension, which will lead evidently to recommendations that are interlinked with each other and lays the path for systemic solutions. Next slide, please. On the basis of our diagnosis and working with the approach that we adopted, we came to the fact that it was necessary to enhance a global pact on financial integrity for sustainable development. And if funds are deployed judiciously, they can fill a massive gap in order to benefit peoples and places from which they are generated. So beyond tracking illicit financial flows, the panel insisted on the use of the expression financing the SDGs, as I already mentioned. And this global pact needs evidently to involve all countries agreeing to take comprehensive action to create financial integrity. So this is a pact which can be the result and should be the result of a global cooperation, of a renewed multilateralism based on ethical values. Next slide, please. If we look at the scale of the resources we stand to gain, they are quite enormous and beyond the qualification of enormous. $7 trillion of private wealth is hidden in heaven countries. 1.6 trillion or 2.7% of global GDP is lost in money laundering by criminals, including drug traffickers, organized crime. 10% of the world GDP may be held in offshore financial assets, and 20 to 40 billion a year is in bribes received by public officials in developing and transitioning countries. So when you look at these numbers and you think about financing development as a critical issue for the years to come, you come to the conclusion that these draining of resources need to be stopped. Next slide, please. So on the basis of our diagnosis, on the basis of our approach, looking at a systemic dimension, 4 systemic solutions, on the basis of the pact that we are targeting, we said that in order to build a better future, very concrete recommendations need to be made. And these recommendations need to be politically viable and technically feasible. So we classified our recommendations in 3 groups, which have to do with values, 3 categories: values, policies, and institutions. And there also you have a triangle of optimization of the fight against illicit financial flows. On the values, we enhanced accountability, legitimacy, transparency, and fairness. On the policies, we looked at how we could best assign a role to enable civil society and media, international cooperation, information sharing, dynamism, policy making, capacity building. And on institutions, we looked at global data collection and dissemination, effective implementation review, national governance arrangements, and global governance arrangements. And let me insist on the fact that national governance arrangements are as important as global governance arrangements. So after having looked at these 3 categories regarding values, policies, and institutions, we made very specific recommendations. And each one of these recommendations is technically feasible and politically viable. And I could go through certain of these recommendations. If we go in the recommendations related to the category of values, we are, for reasons of legitimacy, proposing a UN tax convention. On transparency, we want to make sure that public spending has a sound level of transparency. On accountability, we are looking at standards for settlements in corruption cases. I'm not enumerating all of the recommendations that you will be able to find in the report for reasons of time. And in fairness, we are putting the accent on a global minimum corporate tax. And this is important for us. And capital gains and digital taxation under UN Convention. On the policies, if we look at information sharing, we want to, we propose recommendations, concrete recommendations on how to end information sharing asymmetries related to tax. On dynamism, we are targeting flexible national and international regimes to adjust to new risk. All the recommendations are equally important. On enablers, we think that it's very important to have global professional standards for bankers, lawyers, etc. On capacity building, which is an important part of our recommendation, we think that the strength of the UN research capacity on anti-corruption needs to be expanded, and there needs to be an international compact for financial integrity. On institutions, regarding data collection and publication, we make recommendation on a data center for monitoring taxing rights, and an entity for data on money laundering, an entity for data on asset recovery. On implementation review, we think that UNCAC needs to be updated in terms of implementation review, and peer reviews need to aim at reducing duplication. On global governance, we think that a coordination mechanism at ECOSOC is necessary, and the creation of an intergovernmental tax body needs to be enhanced, and there needs to be an improved formal inclusivity at FATF, as well as the necessity to integrate UNCAC COSP into ECOSOC coordination. And on national governance, which is very important, coordinating national governance mechanisms needs to be enhanced. So in all these categories, we have made very specific recommendations based on an approach which is systemic and aiming at a global pact. And in conclusions, we think that the international community should reform, redesign, and revitalize the global architecture to combat illicit financial flows. The resources released by these 14 recommendations must be spent on delivering sustainable development for all everywhere. So this is why we are extremely proud to present these recommendations, which have to do with financial accountability, transparency, and integrity for sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ibrahim Mayaki. We will now hear the high-level interventions. So we will start by hearing from Her Excellency Ms. Erna Solberg, Prime Minister of Norway.
Begin by congratulating the FACTI panel. And I commend former President Gipasgate and former Prime Minister Mayaki for steady leadership. I thank the panel members for their hard work. Under difficult circumstances, you have given us an ambitious and forward-looking
Hello, Miriam.
Yes?
It seems the video is not playing for our colleagues to see. So if we could move to the live minister, and then we will come back to the video after we fix the technical problem.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so I think you should be able to hear me. Apologies for that, having a bit of a technical problem. Of course, these things happen. Certainly I'm used to them in my work. But I think what we can do is we will hear from Erna Solberg a little bit later on. We will try to establish that connection and fix that technical problem. But actually right now, we can hear from the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Nigeria, Jeffrey Onyema.
Unfortunately, Miriam, it seems the minister is also having some technical trouble.
Oh, well, apologies for that. We appear to be having technical trouble there as well. So we will try and get a connection to Nigeria in a bit, try and get those videos, hopefully, we hope to be able to hear from Erna Solberg, Prime Minister of Norway, also hoping to hear from Imran Khan, Prime Minister of Pakistan. He has spoken very passionately on this issue about the need to level the playing field. And of course, this report's recommendations really trying to address the concerns that if these sort of financial crimes, corporate and individual tax abuse continues, that it will affect absolutely everyone, of course, citizens all over the world, but it is the poorer and developing countries that are disproportionately affected by this at a time when, of course, the world is struggling with the COVID-19 pandemic and an economic crisis that will result from that. Of course, these are the sort of revenues that are needed more than ever for investment in hospitals, healthcare and education. But I think we can go back to Norway.
Friends, let me begin by congratulating the FACTI Panel. And I commend former President Gudbrandsdottir and former Prime Minister Mayaki for steady leadership. I thank the panel members for their hard work. Under difficult circumstances, you have given us an ambitious and forward-looking report. When the panel was launched, we were just entering a global pandemic. A year on, COVID-19 has deepened inequalities. It has been difficult to invest in sustainable development. Illicit financial flows have reinforced social and economic challenges. It is often said that with crisis comes opportunity, and this is such a moment. We should use it to make the reforms needed to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. This will take courage and willingness to act. The panel has engaged extensively with member states and stakeholders, and the dialogue needs to continue. All stakeholders must act together to close the gaps that allow illicit financial flows to flourish. The FACTI panel addresses complex and technical issues, but the objective is clear and simple: stopping the leak of trillions of dollars and challenging more of these resources towards sustainable development. Illicit flows comes in many forms, but the result is always the same. It undermines governance, erodes trust, and increases poverty. No one is immune from this global scourge, but developing countries are especially affected. This means less resources for healthcare, social protection, and quality education. The report shows that many mechanisms do not prevent tax evasions, corruption, and illicit flows. There are gaps in implementation and enforcement. We need stronger standards around accountability, transparency, and integrity. Corruption and financial crime should not go unpunished. Effective implementation of the UN Convention Against Corruption is a key. We should also build on valuable work done at the OECD, the G20, and the IMF. I welcome recent steps to facilitate more country-by-country tax reporting. I am encouraged that more countries are improving transparency on beneficial ownerships. However, many countries are still not participating in the standard-setting bodies. In order to ensure legitimacy of tax norms and standards, we must frame and negotiate them in an inclusive manner. We all share a responsibility to prevent illicit flows from passing through our jurisdictions. A stronger global consensus on tax cooperation is an important step. If we invest in more robust international tax systems, we will receive a healthy and more needed return. Let us heed the call of the FACTI Panel. Let us join the movement towards a financial system built on accountability, transparency, and integrity. We need a global financial system that works for all and leaves no one behind. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. So we have that statement, and I'm very pleased to say that we do have with us, I think we have established a connection to the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Nigeria, Mr. Jeffrey Onyema. The floor is yours. Apologies for that. So I think we are trying to establish a connection with Nigeria. We will do that in just a couple of moments, but I am told that we can hear from the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Co-chairs of the FACTI Panel, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to be invited to address this launch of the final report of the high-level panel on financial accountability, transparency, and integrity. When my government took office 2.5 years ago, the country's coffers were empty, denuded by huge and accumulated trade and fiscal deficits, but more than that, by illicit financial outflows from our country. Your interim report confirmed that due to political and official corruption, as well as crime and tax evasion, trillions of dollars flow out of developing countries each year. $7 trillion in stolen assets are parked in the financial haven countries. The flight of this vast resources from the developing countries is a principal cause of their underdevelopment, poverty, inequality, and political instability. During the consideration of the interim report in September last year, I had suggested several global policy actions, including immediate return of stolen assets, penalties on the financial institutions, lawyers, and accountants, and other enablers of corruption, crime, and tax evasion. Disclosure on the beneficial ownership of companies. A global minimum corporate tax. Fair digital taxation. Review and revision of unequal investment treaties. And a coherent mechanism for monitoring illicit financial flows set up under the United Nations. I'm glad that these proposals have been reflected in the final report of the panel. As the FACTI report states, this is a systemic problem embedded within the international financial architecture. It requires a systemic solution. It cannot be resolved by piecemeal or cosmetic actions. The magnitude of the illicit financial flows is staggering. If recovered and returned, they can have a transformational impact on the development prospects of the developing countries. As the report says, this could enable the developing countries to eradicate poverty, reduce inequalities, build back better after the COVID crisis, address climate change, and strengthen human rights. I endorse the three-point plan proposed by the panel. 1. Apply international values of honesty and integrity to all financial transactions. 2. Strengthen policy frameworks. And 3. Reform and reinforce the relevant institutions dealing with these illicit financial flows. These responses could form a part of global pact for financial integrity. National and cross-border financial transactions should be regulated under a value-based system encompassing accountability, transparency, legitimacy, fairness, inclusion, and equity. These values should be reflected in all national and international financial instruments, institutions, and transactions, and particularly in those bodies which address illicit financial flows. All such activities should conform to rules and standards that are compatible with and contribute to sustainable development. And global financial governance must improve. Policies on illicit flows must be implemented in a coordinated and coherent way by national and international institutions and bodies. International bodies dealing with tax matters, corruption, and illicit financing should be inclusive and representative. They should not be used as an instruments of pressure and coercion against developing countries. A global forum under the United Nations should coordinate all bodies dealing with technical, legal, and political aspects of illicit financial flows. It should incorporate a mechanism to adjudicate and mediate disputes on issues relating to illicit financial flows. Excellencies, it's now time to act on recommendations of the FACTI panel. Pakistan will be happy to join in proposing the adoption of FACTI panel report by the United Nations Economic and Social Council and the General Assembly. We must also take some quick, concrete actions. First, a commitment by haven countries to immediately and unconditionally return all foreign assets that are shown to be stolen or whose legitimacy cannot be explained. The OECD's proposal to freeze and return the unexplained assets of foreign politically exposed persons is worthy of consideration. Secondly, the UN should initiate several steps, including initiate negotiations on the new international tax cooperation and anti-money laundering legal instruments, like the Convention on Corruption. Adopt common principles identified by the FACTI panel that would apply to all financial transactions, and establish a UN coordination, adjudication, and mediation mechanism on illicit financial flows. Pakistan will work actively with all like-minded countries to realize these vital objectives. I thank you.
Right, so I believe now we can go on to our panel discussion. We should have all the panelists with us, and I'm hoping that the connection is a good one. So I think we're ready to introduce the panelists now, and of course the idea is to get into some of the report's 14 recommendations and to see how it can contribute to the dialogue and really move the conversation forward. Of course, there will be some recommendations there in terms of transparency and accountability that many people also in detail at some of the other recommendations, particularly that the possible introduction of a UN tax convention. It'll be very interesting to get the panelists' thoughts on that. So I believe we should have everybody with us. So joining me now on this panel, we have with us Her Excellency Ms. Irma Erendira Sandoval, Minister for Public Administration at Mexico. We also have His Excellency Mr. Abdoulaye Daouda Diallo, Minister of Finance and Budget for Senegal. We have Mr. Marcus Player, President of the Financial Action Task Force, Ms. Anne Cairns, Executive Vice Chair of MasterCard, Mr. Sternford Moyo, President of the International Bar Association, and last but not least, we also have Ms. Gabriela Buca, Executive Director of Oxfam International. So welcome to all of you. I hope we be able to speak to you all and get your thoughts on this final report. But I believe we can begin with Minister Irma Erendira Sandoval. Of course, Mexico, like every other country in the world, has been struggling with an outbreak, but with an outbreak of the coronavirus. But it has been a deteriorating situation in recent months in the country. Hospitals have been really overwhelmed by surging case numbers. Explain to us, Minister, how important it is to tackle financial crime and tax abuse from Mexico's perspective, especially at a time when you're fighting COVID, and how it can really alleviate the healthcare costs related to that.
Good morning. First of all, I'm very grateful for the invitation and honored to be part of this important event where the United Nations is bringing financial corruption into the center of the development agenda. Financial accountability, transparency, and integrity are key to assure that resources have a more effective impact on human welfare. I congratulate the FACTI Panel for raising awareness about such an urgent issue. 60 years ago, Fidel Castro told the General Assembly of the United Nations about the need to do away the philosophy of plunder to truly achieve peace and development. Well, the world hasn't put away the practices of plunder, and we still face today the perils of structural corruption. In the last century, we have built global institutional structures to address and regulate labor, health, security, and economic development. But we've missed the opportunity to create an international framework to ensure that every person complies with their fiscal and financial responsibilities. The important report we are commenting on today shows that it is urgent to invest resources in putting an end to tax evasion, money laundering, and the illegal financial flows which undermine both government and democracy. We must fight together to overcome gaps, vulnerabilities, and structural challenges on global scale. In Mexico, we have taken important steps to prevent the drains of fiscal resources through corruption and illegal financial flows. First of all, we have centralized government procurement, which has led to important cost reduction due to the increased volume of the contracts and a reduction of the discretion inherent to the old decentralized system. On December 2019, as part of the Beneficial Ownership Leadership Group, Mexico adopted the Beneficial Ownership Transparency Disclosure Principle. This allows the cost-free and easy access to beneficial ownership data, as well as improved collaboration with other members on best practices and the improvement of domestic policies. Within the framework of the Fourth Open Government Action Plan, The Mexican authorities and civil society are working together on a national plan to implement an ambitious plan of best practices in ownership transparency and in the technical, legislative, regulatory, and administrative realms. Over the last 2 years, Mexico has also significantly improved tax collection through historical, legal, and policy reforms, which both inhibit tax fraud and cancel all discretionary policies which allowed for special tax breaks and loopholes for the largest payers. These reforms allowed us to collect an extra $10 billion from the largest taxpayers during 2020 without having to litigate any of the cases in court. The Minister of Public Administration that I'm very proud to lead here in Mexico, we have significantly improved our oversight over, of both the revenue the authority and the customs administration. Our new policy is oriented to reduce the flows of illicit money and fight corruption in international trade, even more considering that Mexican flows of the exports and imports currently accounts for almost 70% of our GDP. We are fully committed to fighting against corruption in every sector of government and the economy. And international cooperation is more important today than ever before to achieve this goal. We cannot continue to condemn millions of people to poverty while a very few, accumulate most of the global wealth. To the contrary, we must work together to bring about a more prosperous and egalitarian way of life for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister, for those remarks. And I now believe we have a connection. We finally do have a connection with Nigeria. I can now hand over to Jeffrey Onyema to make some remarks in response to this report, the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Nigeria.
Thank you very much, and we're sorry for the problems we've had, technical problems we've had. Yes, Your Excellencies, the co-chairs of the FACTI panel, it gives me great pleasure to participate in this virtual press launch of the final report of the high-level panel on international financial accountability, transparency, and integrity for achieving the 2030 agenda. I want to thank the panel and its leadership for their transparent engagement with member states throughout the process, leading to its final report. The government of Nigeria welcomes the panel's report and we view the recommendations positively. However, given the bleak picture painted in the interim report and the confluence of challenges confronting the world in the era of COVID-19, we thought that maybe the recommendations might have been a bit stronger in some parts of the report. But nevertheless, we consider the report as reflective of the diversity of perspectives and the delicate views and priorities of different stakeholders on the subject of combating illicit financial flows and strengthening good practices on assets recovery and return to foster sustainable development. We believe that the report covers, to a substantive extent, the enormity of efforts required to tackle the multifaceted dimensions of illicit financial flows, including harmful tax policies and practices, abusive transfer pricing, trade mispricing and misinvoicing, illegal exploitation of natural resources, as well as official corruption and organized crime. And we consider this report timely in the light of the international effort to mobilize resources to finance nationally and internationally agreed development agenda. The FACTI panel report can also contribute positively to the ongoing efforts to broaden the awareness of the scale, the scope, and the cost of illicit financial flows, especially at a time when the widespread and intensifying impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic have disproportionately affected the resource base of most developing countries, thereby narrowing their chances of achieving the 2030 agenda. The report clearly shows that the magnitude of the resources that is lost to illicit financial flows are enormous, and that these rob the majority of our citizens of a better future. And the report also revealed that international financial flows divert substantive financial resources from public priorities and reduce fiscal expenditure on public services, including in areas where women and youth should be the major beneficiaries. IFFs also weaken the state's ability to deliver the developmental expectations of the citizens, as it diverts important resources that could otherwise have been used to enhance human and national security. And in the area of the COVID pandemic, we feel that the subsequent limitation of fiscal space can lead to austerity, which is the last thing that our economies need at this time. We agree with the panel that if not addressed at all levels, IFFs would continue to create a myriad of criminal opportunities that ease the way for powerful individuals and more advanced economies to illegally accumulate resources while hindering national reforms in developing countries, as well as thwarting the global effort to improve financial integrity, transparency, and accountability. I'd also like to emphasize that for the international community to recover better from the COVID-19 pandemic and accelerate the achievement of the 2030 agenda, we must implement all the recommendations contained in the FACTI Panel's final report. These recommendations, if implemented, have the potential to significantly reduce existing structures that make it impossible for countries to generate and retain a sizable chunk of their resources. The panel has correctly underscored the transformative change can only truly be possible when all countries commit to acting together for the greater good of the larger part of humanity. And so we must take collective action to combat illicit outflows and establish financial integrity in all countries and regions. And we're convinced that the idea of a pact or a convention would help us to halt the flow and trace, recover, and return assets of illicit origins, as well as ensure that all funds recouped from the process are directed to finance the 2030 agenda and accelerate the achievement of the SDGs. We also note the panel's acknowledgement of the fact that the contemporary international tax system uses a taxing rights regime that is not suitable for the current era, as it makes combating tax abuses, especially by multinational corporations, a genuine dilemma for most developing countries. The report has also exposed the systemic imbalance and institutional deficiencies in the global tax treaties and structure, particularly as it's anything but inclusive, and its normative foundation framed over a century ago when most developing countries were yet to be really independent. So we believe that unless the peculiarities of developing countries are recognized and properly incorporated, the outcome of the ongoing exercise by the OECD would obstruct practical paths to development in most developing countries. We're gratified that the FACTI panel has made recommendations that can lead us towards a fairer international tax regime, as well as address the continuing advocacy for country-by-country reporting, open disclosure, and automatic exchange of information on beneficial ownership, and also eliminate financial secrecy jurisdictions and tax havens that facilitate base erosion and profit shifting. And we also like the proposals that can help us to mitigate the detrimental effects of profit shifting, harmful tax competition, the so-called race to the bottom, and the taxation of the digital economy. And it's therefore incumbent on us as United Nations member states to do our part in addressing this scourge. And this we can do by resolving to establish a legitimate and transparent global system of laws, norms, standards, and institutions that can be fairer to all, as well as hold all those using the secrecy structures accountable for their abuses as proposed by the panel. Thank you very much for the opportunity to make this intervention. Thank you.
Minister, thank you very much for your remarks there. We appreciate that. We do have with us now Mr. Marcus Player, President of the Financial Action Task Force. I hope you can hear me, Marcus.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Hi.
Okay, that's wonderful.
Hi there. Really, Marcus, really interesting to hear the Minister for Foreign Affairs there just saying that actually he thought the report could be tougher in places in terms of its recommendations. I suppose some would argue that the sort of system that we have now, perhaps your system that relies on banks self-reporting on financial crime, hasn't worked. Are new systems required rather than reforms of the existing ones? Is it time for a robust multilateral system on illicit financial flows? Is that what is needed here?
So thank you for inviting me, for having me today in this important event. And let me first say that I think it's good that we have this FACTI panel report. It reminds us why it is essential to crack down on money laundering, including because of the detrimental effect of sustainable development. So to your question, I think what is really essential, and I think I heard this with some interventions, is that we need the countries to effectively implement the standards that we already have. I'm not so sure that we need new standards. Of course, we always need to review the standards that we have and update them to the changing world. But what we do, the FATF, you know, is the global standard setter on money laundering and terrorist financing. We set the standards, we assess the standards, we assess countries against the standards, and we make public if countries fail. And what we see is that many countries don't implement effectively the global standards. I think we roughly have a very good global international system. Within the FATF, we have 200 jurisdictions that have committed to implement our standards. We have 200 governments, 20 international organizations that work together with us in framing the standards. And I just heard the minister talking about beneficial ownership, which is, I think, at the heart of fighting illicit financial flows. That is very, very important. And these beneficial ownership standards, we are the most important standard setter in this area. The Global Forum looks at our definition. The UN works with us in this. And what we see is that many countries do not implement this because also they have not the capacity and the skills. So it's not a lack of global standards, but we need to help the countries implementing the standards. And here I'm very thankful for the United Nations that help with technical assistance. And I would ask them to continue to support this work, which is really vital. So far from my side.
Thank you very much, Mr. Player. We will definitely come back to you in a bit. I think we can now actually go to Gabriela Boucher of Oxfam International. Do I have Gabriela with me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, hi, Gabriela. I would love to get your response to what we just heard from Marcus, because you could say that governments and businesses, it's in their interest to perhaps say that reform of the existing structures is what's needed because they have a disproportionate power and influence within those structures. There is a critical point in this report, isn't there, about the reform of what we have right now, the instruments that we have right now versus developing new ones. How would you describe the response up to now to countries around the world losing major revenues through both corporate and individual tax abuse? How would you describe the way we've responded to it so far?
Thank you very much. I think I would start by expressing and echoing the sense of urgency. So Oxfam presented the Inequality Virus report earlier this year at Davos. And there we spoke about how as many as 500 million people will be pushed into poverty through this pandemic and its ensuing economic and social crisis. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have 10 men who've made $500 billion since the pandemic began. And that would be more than enough to ensure that no one would be pushed into poverty by the pandemic and even to pay for a COVID-19 vaccine for all. So the resources are there. Vaccine access is generating a new dimension of growing inequalities between countries. And we project that we may see the highest rise in inequality in almost every country at the same time. We're seeing a huge toll on women, on marginalized racial and ethnic groups, and the rising inequalities between nations. So this is why we're calling this the inequality virus. So we welcome this push for joined up action, and we welcome the recommendations outlined in the FACTI report. We believe that new instruments are necessary because as governments finance their pandemic recovery efforts, we're clear of what shouldn't happen. We shouldn't go into a new wave of austerity that would punish the poorest and women hardest. And we would see poverty going back decades. So we instead need a policy mix explicitly designed to pursue greater equality. So we know what works, investment into universal education, health, and we know that we should move away from goals of GDP alone and consider more integral well-being goals, and the SDGs are very well designed in that respect. So to resource this, we need to implement progressive taxation, and as the FACTI report states, address tax evasion, abuse, corruption, and illicit financial flows. So we need a bold agenda to really enable efficient taxation internationally to finance the pandemic recovery and achieve and accelerate the achievement of SDG goals. So we need to see substantial and additional revenues raised, especially for developing countries, because we have an issue of fairness in the tax system, and the work on the minimum corporate tax globally is fundamental, and it should work for all countries, not be rigged in favor of rich countries' companies. So beyond tax reform, countries can do much more in terms of taxing wealth and capital. And for that, also transparency, which is highlighted in this report, is essential. So we need to really stop the drain of resources that is lost to illicit activities and tax evasion. We're losing over 427 billion in tax each year to international corporate tax abuse and private tax evasion, according to Tax Justice Network. And this is equivalent to 34 million nurses' annual salaries every year, or one nurse's annual salary every second. And I think after this year, we understand and we can make the case for the public of what this means and have a joined up approach to really respond to the pandemic with a new social contract.
All right, thank you very much, Gabriella. I appreciate that. And I'd be really curious to perhaps get the thoughts of Anne Kearns, who now joins us from MasterCard. Great to have you with us, Anne. Would love to get your thoughts on what Gabriella said there about a minimum corporate tax. The report says that multinational corporations shouldn't be allowed to resort to profit shifting to lower tax jurisdictions for the purposes of avoiding taxation. Do you support a global minimum corporate tax to prevent this practice?
Well, actually, as MasterCard, we're in over 200 countries in the world, and we have offices in about 80 plus countries. And where we have a structure, then we believe in paying taxes in the right countries. So from a company perspective, that's certainly my point of view. I think if I look at what I think can happen in terms of really helping from a technological point of view on getting control of illicit companies like us, the technology enablers, we can track what's happening as money moves around the world. MasterCard itself deals with 75 billion transactions on a real-time basis. And where we have the infrastructure, we can use things such as artificial intelligence to see things like money mules moving money from one bank account to another. We can certainly see that in places like Britain, where we actually run the bank-to-bank infrastructure for the whole country. And that's really where I see the corporate world playing its role. And of course, in order to be able to do this, we have to work alongside the regulators in each country, and we have to make sure that we're working with regulated instruments, which is why a couple of weeks ago, when we said we were going to move cryptocurrencies through our network now, we're not talking about things like Bitcoin, which is often used for illicit purposes, but we're talking about things like stable currencies and digital currencies developed by central banks, which are produced in an appropriate way, meet all of the guidelines, and are transparent in the way that they operate. Because really what we're talking about here is not just the sort of illicit movement of money, but really building a public trust across the world and being able to reach everyone everywhere and provide a service that people can feel comfortable and confident about.
So can I ask you then, Anne, to that end, in terms of building public trust, one of the key points is country by country reporting. Is it time to make that completely public so that it's harder for companies to shift profit?
I think the idea of how a company runs and its profit and the way that the financial markets work around the world is a different topic from the one that I've actually been discussing. But I think company transparency, is absolutely what we need. And I think actually investors demand that today. And it's not just transparency about how you're running your business, but it's also, what values do you stand for? What are your ethics and what are you investing in yourself? And how are you treating men and women in your company? I know, for example, in MasterCard, we now publish our global gender pay gap, which is just around about 8% on a global basis. And this is very important because, as Gabriella pointed out, for example, COVID is having a massive impact on the lives of women. And in many cases, in many countries, they're going backwards. One of the things I'd say about the report, by the way, is that I thought it could be strengthened about the role of women, not just what these flows are doing to the lives of women, but also how women could actually step in there to help solve the problem. I'm actually the global chair of the 30% Club, and I think women in leadership could be very impactful.
As you say, it's a really good point about gender equality and how financial crime can widen those inequalities, and we'll definitely get your thoughts on that a bit later. I did want to come to Mr. Sternford Moyo, President of the International Bar Association. Welcome. I hope you can hear me. Well, we can see you. We have a perfect picture, but the audio not so good. I might just try again. Mr. Sternford Moyo, if you can hear me, you might have to unmute yourself. No, I'm afraid we can't hear you. All right, well, we'll try and get a connection to Mr. Moyo in a bit. But of course, do we still have with us Marcus Player? I want to touch on a point that Marcus made. If we could go back to Marcus, if he is with us. Oh, we're having some technical.
I'm with you again. Okay.
Hello, Marcus. Hi.
Yes, hi, I'm back.
Wonderful. You made a point about beneficial ownership, and of course, one of the key findings here it revolves around transparency and the problem of secrecy. And the report mentions an automatic exchange of financial information, beneficial ownership, transparency, and country by country reporting. You did touch on beneficial ownership, so revealing the real owners of companies and trusts. What do you think about making beneficial ownership public? Because I think currently your organization talks about administrative access, but it doesn't talk about public registries.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. We think that the most effective is a multi-pronged approach. So if country have several sources at place for getting the up-to-date and accurate beneficial ownership information. So one is, for example, the company that provides the information, then you have the financial institution that has the information, and then, of course, there can be national registries. And if you can cross-check these three kinds of these sources of information, you get the best quality. So public registries is an option that we encourage and that we discuss to encourage countries to have this. But you must also see, as I said before, we have more than 205 countries that committed to our standards. Each country is different. Each country has different systems, different data protection laws. So you must respect this. So we cannot really go and oblige every country maybe to have a public one. It depends on the national legal system. So we encourage to have this as one very strong tool. But as you say, it's not an obligatory requirement by now. And we are currently.
Does that need to change? I know that you. I mean, I know you say that you can't compel countries to take certain measures because it's a question of individual government policy. But I mean, does that again not show that now is really the time for a UN tax convention because the current structures are just not working?
So I don't want to preempt the discussions. We are indeed currently in a review process, and we are also talking about registries and also about public registries. But again, we think it's a strong tool, and it's not about government policies, Chair. It's about also an issue of human rights, which data protection belongs to. And there are countries that have reservations when it comes to public registries. So that is something that we have to discuss with these countries.
And those discussions are underway, you said?
Exactly. We are in the midst of a review process of the beneficial ownership standard.
How's that going?
Well, it's imagine when you have an inclusive organization like mine, when you have 205 jurisdictions sitting together and discussing it. It takes time, but we always come in the end to a very productive result. So I'm confident.
Can I ask you, Marcus, about the report sets a higher standard than FATF in the way it requests beneficial ownership data to be more transparent and available. Should FATF agree with this as requested by the panel's report, particularly in terms of, I'm thinking more about developing countries, so kind of making sure that developing countries that are desperately in need of this information can get access to it in a speedy and efficient way?
Could you repeat the last question, please? The last sentence?
Yeah, I was just asking you about the exchange of data and how we can make sure that developing countries, poorer countries that need this information, can get access to beneficial ownership information in a speedy way.
Yeah, this is about international cooperation, which is indeed also essential. And this sometimes works very well. Sometimes you can exchange this information between countries within a day or even within hours. But in other parts, it's difficult. So this is also something that we discuss to improve. Again, I cannot preempt the outcome of that discussion, but exchanging this information cross-border is important. And if you have public registries, of course, it's an advantage because if it's public, you can connect these registries and you can directly access these registries. But what I want to say again, it's very important that the current standard is something that must be implemented. And what we see is that most countries do not implement this effectively. So before we really must look into new standards, we need the countries to implement the ones that are at place right now.
Gabriella, can I get your thoughts on that? Is it more about trying to ensure that, is it about trying to ensure that countries meet the current standards that are in place, as opposed to perhaps trying to bring about a fundamental shift in the global architecture?
So I think the report is ambitious, as was being said at the beginning in the presentation. It's systemic transformation. And for that, I welcome very much recommendation 7 around the role of civil society, because it's an important, very important element in changing the social contract and on demanding something different. There is, unfortunately, a high degree of tolerance for these current practices that are draining resources from states and which inevitably end up, as I was saying earlier, with situations that challenge all of us in terms of our access to healthcare and the basic human rights issues that we have around the world. So if we enable civil society to be active, and as you know, civic space and the ability of people to organize and to speak out, to influence decisions that affect their lives, will hold governments to account, and also the
Can I ask you something, Gabriella? Can I ask you something very? So I mean, I was just thinking. We were speaking about the sort of gulf in information, the way information is exchanged between developing and developed countries, and I suppose global standards negotiated at the OECD and the G20. How much of an issue, in your view, is bias, both in terms of political interest, but also in the way the system is designed?
So I think the system was the global architecture of tax was not aligned to the globalization at the speed it should have happened. So I think these are now urgent catch-up measures, and as others have spoken before, it's very important that we also tax the digital economy that is elusive to the majority of the low-income countries and middle-income countries. So how do we ensure that the prosperity in some sectors of the economy can actually be shared widely, so that we don't have the growing inequality and the immoral situation in which we find ourselves now? So it's a big part of this, and it's part of the systemic changes that are suggested in this report, is to have the data and transparency, and then of course to act on it. And as I was saying, on the issue of whistleblowers and people who have the courage to denounce corruption, or investigative journalists, it is important, and this is a recommendation of the report, that there is a minimum standard of protection, and this would be something that would make a step change versus the situation that we have at the moment. It would be, if it were to be binding in all states, and that we can actually ensure that then as a result, of course, trust would be enhanced, and the whole system would be more enabling to tax payments and less evasion.
Well, you know, maybe actually you've the note that you end on there is a great place to go to. Mr. Stanford Moyo from the International Bar Association. Hello, you're finally with us.
Hello, can you hear me now?
We can hear you. Wonderful. Wonderful. So I'm glad that you're with us, and I'm not sure if you heard much of what we've heard from Marcus Player and Gabriella, but as you well know, jurisdictions have varying standards in financial transparency and in effectively tackling the enablers of financial crimes that Gabriella was just referring to. How do you break the cycle of financial crime when the enablers, the people that facilitate it, are seeking those jurisdictions with the lowest standards?
Yes, I think the starting point really is to say that the International Bar Association and the vast majority of lawyers do support financial integrity and the sustainable development goals. As International Bar Association, we have worked in collaboration with a number of international organizations in trying to ensure that we combat illicit financial flows. We produced our own report, in fact, on the negative effects of illicit financial flows, on efforts to fight poverty and efforts to ensure equality. We also, in our research, concluded that the realization of human rights it's virtually impossible in circumstances where resource mobilization is defeated by illicit financial flows. So you will find that the majority of lawyers are committed to financial integrity. In fact, integrity is at the heart of any lawyers association or any bar association. Most bar associations adhere to very high standards of integrity, and they often deal very severely with their members when they depart from the requirements.
Mr. Moyo, can I ask you, I appreciate what you say about the majority of bar associations behaving in a certain way, but what do you do about those that don't want to tackle crimes?
Yes.
Well, I don't know,
Yes.
the Cayman's Bar Association, for example, they're not going to do much about this.
Yes. You see, those lawyers who do not adhere to financial integrity and commit crimes should really be dealt with by the criminal system, because these are criminals. Like in any profession, you do find those who do not adhere to the high standards that the profession requires. They should be dealt with severely. What is wrong, I think, is what is proposed in the report, that we must increase government regulation of the legal profession, among others. Now, it must be understood that self-regulation of the legal profession is at the heart of lawyer independence. And lawyer independence is a prerequisite for judicial independence. And without judicial independence, you can't really have the rule of law. So that aspect of the report clearly cannot be supported by right-thinking lawyers. The other,
so you don't. But then, can I ask? I mean, if bar associations self-regulate, but if it's not working in certain jurisdictions, in certain places, should governments step in then to establish standards to tackle enablers of financial crime?
Oh, self-regulation has been with us for a very long time. In fact, you are looking at more than a century from the 1700s. And it has worked effectively. The whole idea of an organized legal profession started off with lawyers regulating themselves. And after lawyers had successfully regulated themselves, governments started giving them statutory authority to enhance the self-regulation. It is not correct that self-regulation has not worked merely because a few lawyers have committed financial crimes. Once you remove self-regulation and allow governments to regulate the legal profession, you may as well forget about lawyer independence. Now, independence of the legal profession, as I indicated, is critical to observance of the rule of law, because you can't have judicial independence unless there is an independent legal profession.
But forgive me, I suppose one thing the report, the report, I think, acknowledges that you need to have self-regulation, and it's important for the independence of the lawyers and the judiciary, of course, but there are lawyers in multiple jurisdictions that are using that privilege to assist criminals.
Yes, those should be dealt with severely by the legal systems in those countries, because you can't throw the baby away together with the water. You've got to deal with those that are not observing the laws in order to.
Mr. Mori, I thank you. I would love to get some further thoughts from you, but I would love to then also hear from Marcus Player. We were just speaking about, the enablers of financial crime and money laundering. What more can your organization do to tackle that?
So I cannot stress enough how critical the role of enablers are, especially lawyers. And I just heard the colleague from the International Bar Association that very much looks at law enforcement. So at the penal courts, the investigation, the authorities. But there's also the prevention side. So what we require countries is to have an effective supervision also of these lawyers, that they oblige to risk assessment, that they make suspicious transaction reporting and all these issues. And this is really what we see in many countries is not working very well. So I wouldn't exclude that self-regulation can work, but where it does not work, a country, a government must really consider whether it needs a better system, because this is really, again, a critical role that lawyers play, especially when it comes to fake companies. So this must be an efficiently supervised area. And I must say, sometimes there are also lawyers not knowingly doing this, but unwittingly. And so there's also a matter of education, of understanding what are the risks of a lawyer to be misused by clients. So that is the area where we work. We have the standards already in place. Again, it must be.
Can we? Is it really to say that they're misused by clients? I mean, we do see regulation working when it comes to minor breaches for lawyers, but when it comes to, systemic financial crime on a massive scale, senior partners will simply get away with it. Can we really say that they're being taken advantage of?
No, you're right. I mean, there are those criminals that the colleague from the International Bar Association just talked about. And that is what you just said, what we call professional money laundering by lawyers. That's absolutely clear. But take, for example, a lawyer that advises a client in real estate, and he does not know that this real estate is for money laundering. So this can also happen. And this is where a lawyer must understand what are the risk indicators. If someone comes and wants to buy real estate with cash, then he should have alarm bells in his brain. So there are a lot of risk indicators that also lawyers must learn and understand.
Oh, I guess the unfortunate thing is that they don't always have the alarm bells in the brain. But can I ask you? You were saying that you are currently having talks and discussions with your members, and the implementation of the current system is a problem. If there was a greater UN role in regulating enablers of financial crime, I'm just wondering if this would help make your organization's recommendations more effective. It would be easier to implement your own recommendations if there were a greater UN role.
So the UN is part of our organization, so they are participating in our standard setting. But where they can play, or where they already play a big role, and where they can even increase their role, is in technical assistance. Especially in countries that have not the resources to build up systems like the effective supervision I was just talking about. So this is indeed something where the UN can play a big role in the implementation of the standards.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marcus. I think we can you've spoken a great deal about the need for international cooperation on this because there is a great deal of technical knowledge and expertise in this part of the financial system, but fundamentally, many would say that it is a political problem, and that it's important to break the political deadlock in order to get genuine progress on tackling these financial crimes. And I think we can hear a bit more from Her Excellency Minister Sandoval. Minister Sandoval, I would like your thoughts on how we can better foster the spirit of international cooperation on this issue.
Thank you for the opportunity with your question. We agree with the conclusions presented by the FACTI panel. Illicit financial flows are a systemic problem that requires structural solutions. Secrecy, not openness, and transparency tends to dominate the financial sector at the international level, unfortunately. The law protects fiscal, corporative, technological, and bank secrecy. And these mechanisms shield the private sector from scrutiny, allowing to avoid complying with its fiscal responsibilities. It is important to put a special focus on the power relations that lie beneath markets. The control of economic policy decisions by market powers puts democratic institutions at the service of a special interest. The private sector requires transparency and anti-corruption controls just as strict as those focused on the public sector and governments. During the 2 recent decades, the most controversial cases of illegal financial flows allowed by international financial entities demonstrate the dangers of a lack of regulation. The international community needs to come together to coordinate its works against money laundering and tax evasion. Divided efforts create perverse side effects. For instance, low-income countries all around the world try to compete and gain resources by lowering their transparency and accountability standards. The international community needs to step in wherever they are voicing financial integrity. In order to do so, we have to make an effort, a special effort, to share information and our successful experiences and best practices. We need to design together inclusive and very strict standards for overcoming secrecy. We cannot forget that in a world where our economies are intimately connected, global transparency is only as strong as the weakest link. Now, in international actions, it is important, those international actions are important, but it is not enough. We also need to point out finger at the specific responsibilities of the most developed countries. They should be pressured to apply the financial centers within their jurisdictions to comply with global transparency laws. The most developed economies allocate huge amounts of resources to the fight against terrorism. In contrast, they struggle against corruption is not given the same priority, and it's often covered with secrecy. In general, there is an urgent need to show citizens all around the world that governments are capable of controlling money laundering and tax evasion, and also that the new resources are invested in development and fighting inequality. If we cannot achieve this, we should be prepared for a perfectly justified citizen backlash, which will put in question the credibility and the legitimacy of democratic government itself. And if we don't act soon, we will never be able to achieve the 2030 agenda. Overcoming poverty through democratic development will only be possible if we successfully tame the monster of illegal financial flows through coordinated international action. Thank you very much.
Minister Sandoval, thank you very much. I appreciate your contribution. Thank you for your remarks. Anne Kans, we can come back to you. And I wanted to ask you, obviously, MasterCard is a global enterprise and you follow international standards, but at the same time, you have to adapt to local rules and local markets. The report, as you know, is calling for more international standards for behavior for professionals, including financial institutions. How might that affect the service that you bring to the public? And is there something that can be done to improve it?
Well, you're right. We actually have to abide by all of the regulations around the world in order to be able to move money around, which is what we do on a global basis. And we're obviously very keen on global standards because global standards create inefficiency. So, for example, global standards for data transfer, we think can be extremely important. But as an earlier speaker said, you have to reflect and respect what the local jurisdiction thinks about things. But I'm glad actually that there's a lot of work going on thinking about global standards for privacy for citizens, such as GDPR in Europe. But that's about protecting the rights of citizens. It's a bit like SPQR, you know, the rights of the Roman citizen, if you like. And it's about people owning their own data and deciding how that data should be used. And I think that actually protecting people in that way is a good thing to be doing. You know, with respect to the last speaker from Mexico, thinking about that citizens, if they don't feel they're being protected this way, will actually start to speak out about it. But not only that, they'll start to vote with their feet. And they will start using financial providers and other providers that actually protect their rights about these things. And so we feel very, very strongly about this. In terms of picking up things like financial fraud and so on, obviously, if you have global data, that's fantastically useful. We build safety nets around the world that can track the way that money is moving. And because we see transactions in real time, our safety nets can see money moving before, before it even hits the ground at some banks or, in different countries. And this can help us actually prevent fraud, as I mentioned earlier, using new techniques now built with artificial intelligence to stay one step ahead of the cyber criminals or, one step ahead of people trying to defraud the system. And this is the type of thing that I think global big tech and financial companies can do to make things better. It's all about enablement.
Thank you very much, Anne. Appreciate that. I just want to get some final thoughts from our speakers on international cooperation and a UN tax convention, because we've discussed transparency, but that alone isn't enough. Change, we've said, is only possible when countries really commit to acting together for the greater good and to really take collective action to combat those illicit financial flows. And I want to ask you, Gabriella, if you are still with us. Gabriella, I mean, we have the United Nations, don't we, for negotiating climate agreements, sustainable development goals, human rights, on all these issues. We go to the UN to ensure that everyone is at the table, all countries. It's the sort of fair, equitable way to approach global problems. Why are global tax standards set apart from these other issues?
Yes, absolutely. And that's why we absolutely believe that FACTI is necessary, because at the moment the system is not working and there's no global governance to really deliver to ensure these loopholes are closed. And I think it's not only about the illegal flows, but tax evasion that, as I was saying earlier, is somehow normalized. So how do we change the social norms and ensure that this is actually a demand by civil society in all countries? Because we need to see the link between tax evasion and then what happens at the other end in the lack of health, of education, extreme poverty, hunger. So how do we ensure the mindset change to demand action and ensure their standards, and also all these crimes are detected thanks to the very brave action of individuals, investigative journalists being very important. So we need to make sure they are protected so that these denouncements continue.
Mr. Moyo, can I come to you? What are your thoughts on finally closing those governance gaps that Gabriella described? Is now finally the time to establish a UN tax convention? Do you support that recommendation? Mr. Moyo, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes. What I think is important is we have heard a lot, and we saw in the report that there's reference to the importance of building trust. Now, in order to build trust, you really have to trust those that operate the system. Lawyers are involved in enactment of laws. They are involved in enforcement of laws. Once you build a system that is based on lawyers being attacked as enablers of crime, you actually undermine confidence in the legal system itself. You undermine confidence in the law itself. Undermining confidence in the law is one of the most dangerous things that you can do, because ultimately you cannot have a climate of legality in an environment in which there is no trust in the law. So I can't overemphasize the importance of ensuring that we just deal with those lawyers that are not compliant using the criminal system and using our disciplinary procedures. Most law firms and bar associations actually already subscribe to client due diligence. They try to make sure that their systems, their services are not abused by criminals. Bar associations enforce that quite vigorously, and most respectable law firms enforce that vigorously. It's only a few bad eggs, really, which you will find in any profession that are not compliant. And in order to build trust in the legal system, in the enforcement measures that we are creating, we've got to ensure that there's trust and faith in the legal professionals that enforce the system, that create the system, and in the law itself.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moyo. Appreciate that. Marcus, you're still with us.
Yes, I'm here.
Marcus, you've been very open and candid on some of these questions about the flaws that are currently there. And I would love to know your thoughts then on whether the UN can tackle these crimes in a multilateral forum, and how there can be more cooperation between your organization and a forum like that.
So you were originally asking about this UN tax issue, and indeed we are not an international tax organization, but tax evasion plays a role if it's illegal as a predicate offense of money laundering. So and here we work closely together with the OECD. I think you're aware of this work that has helped, I think, a lot. And I think if the UN gets part of this cooperation between OECD, UN, FATF when it comes to predicate offense, that could be very helpful to bring this forward.
Right. So how would you work with a proposed UN tax convention?
Well, again, I wouldn't comment on the tax convention, as this is outside my mandate.
Well, actually, I would love to go. I'd like to switch tack a little bit and go to Gabriella on gender equality or inequality, because this is something that the report did mention, Gabriella, and I would love to know. I would love to know your thoughts on this, because obviously it was already stark. It was already a challenge. It's intensified during the pandemic. And I'm just wondering how these panel's findings could go towards achieving gender inequality, because I suppose many of the individuals involved in these sort of crimes are men, but then also the effects of these crimes have a disproportionate effect on women.
Yes, so I think one of the issues that the report also highlights is the importance of gender disaggregated data. So that is one of the ways in which one concretely understand how issues affect in different ways men, women, and non-conforming genders. But in terms of what you're saying, in reality, it's mostly the most disproportionate effect of all these combined evasion and illicit flows is on women and marginalized racial and ethnic minorities. So it's how to, as I was saying earlier, make the connection between these crimes and this tax evasion that happens at such widespread level, and the inability of girls and women to fully realize their rights. And I think there, in that case, it's to amplify the voices of women and feminist groups who are actively seeking to change this dynamic and to transform society into a more caring society, and to realize everything that is being lost through this obsession and this greed that is in fact reflected through these issues that we're discussing today.
Yeah, the financial issues and international issues, but we mustn't forget that it's something that affects everyone, and it is very much a human story at the same time, sadly often involving poor and vulnerable populations. And I would like to cross now to Minister Sandoval for any final remarks that you would like to make in response to the report and its recommendations. Minister Sandoval, I'm not sure if you can hear me. Oh, we appear to be having some technical issues. Let's see if we can try and get the minister in a couple of seconds. Not sure if you can hear me, Minister Sandoval. Yeah, well, we can see you, but we're having some audio trouble there. Okay. Let's just see if we can try and get this connection right. Okay, well, shame, but I'm sure we'll have a chance to perhaps catch up with the minister a bit later on. But in fact, actually, we do now have Her Excellency Miss Dalia Gerbutskaite, former President, closing remarks.
So, Minister or me, who is going to?
You.
I'm finalizing.
Yes, for closing remarks. We're having some technical problems with the minister in Mexico.
But maybe she already not in the problems.
Can we hear the minister?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, we have you back. We had your vision the whole time, but we couldn't hear you. You were on mute. Wonderful to have you back. So listen, Minister, we were hearing just towards the end of the discussion, you were concluding on the issue of the opportunity now to finally move this into a multilateral forum. We've spoken about a UN tax convention, but also the impact that these crimes have on gender inequality. I'm just wondering if you have any final thoughts and remarks you'd like to make on the report.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity of this final report, in which I would like to simply add that current standards to tackle financial crime have proven insufficient. I don't think that this is only a problem of national capacity, but also of the enforceability of international standards. So along with the national actions that are, of course, very, very important, we have to improve, as the FACTI report suggests, the international architecture to facilitate implementation, to facilitate enforcement, and to ensure this implementation of basic standards of financial integrity, and very importantly also transparency in all the situations that are related with these important issues. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and greetings from Mexico.
Thank you very much, Minister Sandoval. Appreciate it. We can now hear concluding remarks from Her Excellency Ms. Dalia Garbutskaite.
Okay, do you hear me? Everything fine?
Yeah, looking good. We can hear you.
Okay, good. So I am wrapping up, and I would like, of course, to thank you very much, everybody who participated, who expressed an interest in our report, because we think that all year the FACTI panel was working very intensively. We consulted widely with governments, with civil society, with academia, and that's the very ambitious plan we are putting on the table to everybody, because we thought that the already agreed standards of financial behavior and taxation and financial system, global one, is not sufficient to solve the development goals all of us we would like to see, and the world, especially after the post-COVID situation, we would like to see. And we know that these ambitious goals we proposing could be implemented only boldly, with bold actions, and with strong political will. This is very clear. More than ever before, time has come to take concrete measures to build financial integrity, and all countries practically committed for sustainable development. And we must create, because of that, global economic system that is fair and equitable if we would like to reach the goals we would like to see. So I believe that the 14 recommendations of the FACTI panel will pave the way towards this critical and long overdue shift. It is really about a redesign of global financial system. And I'm delighted to hear some very open, positive, and some neutral, or some even, let's say, in soft critical elements of our report. It's understandable and it was expected. I'm very grateful also for the presidents of the General Assembly and the president of ECOSOC, of Social Council, who very much supported us, both previous ones and today's, all efforts the panel did. And of course, our great secretariat who helped us on the way to all panel members to do their job. So we all are sharing the responsibility. And actions already can start now. Governments can start with their national policies and national governance arrangement. There is no need to any international agreements for that. Businesses can begin to take leadership on developing culture of integrity to end sometimes bribery and immoral or aggressive tax abuses. Even improved information sharing among governments with spontaneous information disclosures can start already today. For that, nobody needs any negotiations, just the will. For actions at the United Nations, we call on governments to use upcoming negotiations to agree on next steps. These occasions are coming just now. This includes the negotiations on the outcome document of the ECOSOC Forum on financing for development at the outcome of the UN General Assembly special session on corruption, both in early 2021. And we know that some items we are proposing can only be agreed later in the General Assembly and the UNCAC Conference of State Parties. But there are a lot of events they could be used. We call on you not to miss these opportunities, especially governments and civil society. We need many countries and regions to take leadership and champion these changes. Without the ownership, there will be no changes. Finally, many recommendations will be adopted through other venues like FATF and regional bodies like ASEAN, ASEAN, African Union, and European Union. The members of CD and G20 also have an important role to bring faster progress on critical issues and forge understanding among large economies on the way forward. And we have given an agenda that everyone can advance through determination and determined actions. So everybody will depend only on us, on all of us. So let's not miss the chance. Thank you very much to all who participated, who was interested in, and who will support further actions to change the global financial system. Thank you.